In late January of 1968, an Iowa State University freshman was hoping to make her way home to Evanston, Illinois for the weekend. She had planned to ride back with her boyfriend, but when those plans fell through, she needed to find another way home. Rather than thumbing a ride along the side of a highway, students on campus had something a little more organized: a rideshare board where people could offer rides or request one themselves. Sheila Collins added her name and was relieved when a last-minute ride became available. But Sheila never arrived home, and 2 days later, a father and son discovered her body in a ditch along a gravel road. Decades later, her case still lingers in the community, haunting generations of students and community members alike who continue to wonder what happened that cold Friday evening. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Sheila Collins. At the top of this episode, I'd like to acknowledge a few incredible sources for this case. As you know, cases this old can be tricky to get information on, but in addition to all the original newspaper clippings, there is also the Iowa Cold Case website, which is easily one of the best cold case database websites in the country. It's so well run and so much care is put into keeping the cases out there. Jody Ewing is the person who did the write-up for Sheila's case on that. And then Sheila was a student at Iowa State University, and in 2022, a group of students from the School of Journalism did a huge project in the student-run newspaper, the Iowa State Daily. They did a 5-part series on the case, and they spent months in the fall of 2021 talking to old law enforcement, conducting original interviews, and also pulling old sources together. As always, these will all be linked in the show notes. I've also linked a piece from Nancy Bowers, who has done an incredible deep dive into her case. So now let's get into it. In January of 1968, Sheila Jane Collins was feeling a bit homesick. She was a freshman at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, which is a college town about 30 miles north of Des Moines. It was roughly 350 miles from home for Sheila, who was born in Elmhurst, Illinois, and then grew up and graduated from high school in Evanston, Illinois, north of Chicago. In the last weekend that month, she was hoping to go back and visit her parents, James and Muriel, along with her 2 younger sisters, Patricia and Lee. And as a bonus, she was going to see her boyfriend. His name was Ira Frank, and they had grown up together, and now he was going to college in one place and she in another. He was attending Northern Illinois University. The couple had that young love, and there's still actually photographs of her notebooks that show her scribbling his name in the margins of her notes. They were navigating the long distance thing, but they still loved each other a lot and were eager to see one another regularly. But for this particular weekend, they ran into a snag in their plans. Originally on that Friday, Ira was going to drive to Iowa to pick up Sheila and bring her home. But a conflict came up and he was no longer able to give her a ride. Sheila didn't have a car on campus, so she was disappointed. In a last-ditch attempt, she thought she'd try an option that many students were using. Iowa State University has a centralized hub called Memorial Union, and in it was a student-led rideshare map. Basically, I'll have a picture of it from the old newspaper clippings on the Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod, but it was a map of the United States, and above the board was a sign that said, "Going My Way," and it was actually called the Going My Way board. And then all over the country, there were numbered pins for places that students may be traveling to or may need to travel to. And below the map, there were these pockets with the corresponding numbers listed on them. And you could place one of 2 3x5 contact cards in there. There were pink cards and green cards. Pink indicated you were traveling somewhere and were willing to give somebody a ride, and then the green cards were for people seeking rides. So Sheila filled out the green card. It gave her phone number and indicated that she lived in the dorms in Elm Hall, and she was looking for a ride either to her boyfriend's college or the Chicago area. If she had made it to Ira, he would give her a ride the rest of the way. She placed it in the corresponding pocket and went about her day, planning on attending a party with her friends that evening. But those plans would change abruptly when at about 7:30 p.m. on Friday, January 26, 1968, she received a phone call. It was from a man who said that he would be able to give her a ride out to Chicago if she could be ready in 15 minutes. She was elated and said, "Sure, but can you give me 20 minutes?" The caller agreed and told Sheila to meet him at the corner of Lincoln Way and Beach Avenue, which is the first main intersection entering the campus from the east. So keep in mind that this means they're going to leave in the dark in January around 8 p.m., and they wouldn't be arriving to Chicago until the middle of the night, roughly about 3 a.m. I think many of us hearing this today, we may have some pause about those circumstances, but ride sharing in this way on campuses was incredibly common back then, as was hitchhiking from the side of the road. And there wasn't this sense of any safety concern. Plus, Sheila was likely so excited to land a ride that it's possible she suspended some questioning of any safety because of her excitement over riding it. So she got off the phone and told her roommates she would not be attending the party. She spoke to Ira at around that time as well, briefly, and then she called her family, who said they would stay up and wait for her arrival. She then quickly threw together and packed her plaid suitcase with a textbook, her Polaroid camera, a dress, and a few other common items, and she got ready to head out. She borrowed $2 in travel money from a friend, and then she asked if any of her friends would be willing to walk the 5 minutes across campus and wait with her for her ride. This, to me, tells me that she at least had a slight bit of pause. Unfortunately, they all declined, saying they had other plans and couldn't help. So Sheila grabbed her things and set out on her own, navigating the campus she had grown familiar with until she reached the intersection. Several witnesses would later come forward saying they saw a woman who matched Sheila's description waiting there. And then others would say that they saw her get into a blue Volkswagen. One detail noted was that it had an oval-shaped back window, something often found on certain Volkswagen Beetles, and I'll have a picture of what I mean on Instagram. Sheila's family grew worried as the hours ticked on and she didn't arrive home. And midday on Saturday, they reported her as a missing person. The search didn't have very long to get underway. On Sunday, January 28, 1968, a father-son duo made a terrible discovery. Dr. Roger Hogel and his 8-year-old son were driving back roads to go fox hunting in rural Colo, Iowa, which is about 20 miles east of Ames. The pair were going hunting for that day. As they drove down the gravel road, Dr. Hogel's son mentioned to his father that he thought he saw a child's foot. Dr. Hogel turned back, and as he got closer, the scene became clearer. A woman's body was oddly positioned, nude except for a sweatshirt around her neck and a coat draped over the back of her. It was obvious that she was deceased, and so Dr. Hogel jumped back in his car, drove to police to inform them of his discovery, and then drove back to block traffic to the gravel road so that nobody else would happen upon the discovery. Dr. Hogel would later say that he got the sense that police possibly knew who they were about to find, given the missing persons report of the co-ed who was hitching a ride home. And as police arrived on scene, they would get confirmation with ID found amongst the victim's belongings. Sheila Collins had been murdered, likely lured based on her ride posting, and now detectives were going to have to try to find an elusive killer. Sheila Collins was found in a ditch off of a rarely traveled gravel road. She was mostly nude with just a shirt pulled up around her neck area. Some sources say she still had a bra on as well. She then had her coat draped over the back of her, and she was face down on her knees, so in a kneeling position and slumped over. The rest of her clothing, her suitcase, her belongings, it had all been tossed onto and over a nearby barbed wire fence. Because she was found like this with most of her clothes removed, it was suspected but not immediately confirmed that she was the victim of a sexual assault. But more on that in a bit. Sheila had a cord with one knot tied very tightly around her neck. In fact, one of the original investigators described it to the press as, quote, tight as hell. There was also a metal pipe nearby. Now, this had not been used to strike Sheila. Rather, it had been used in her strangulation. Investigators believe the ligature may have included the pipe threaded into the knot, allowing it to be twisted tighter and tighter, functioning almost like a mechanical turning handle. Each rotation would increase pressure without requiring constant force, a method sometimes referred to as a tourniquet-style strangulation. Sheila was transported to the county medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Establishing time of death was a little less precise back in the late 60s, but it was estimated that she died late Friday evening or early on Saturday. Her death was ruled a homicide by strangulation, and it was believed that Sheila was killed at a different location and her body was then brought to the ditch. The autopsy also set out to determine if Sheila had been sexually assaulted, and here is how they worded their findings. They said that the co-ed was not raped, but that a sexual assault of another nature was possible. Now, I'm going to go into this a little bit more graphically than usual, so just a content warning. Skip ahead about 30 seconds or so if this will be triggering to you. But basically, according to reporting in the Iowa State Daily and the conversations they had with current detectives, the way an examination was done then to determine rape is that light and magnification would be used to look for minor tears or trauma on the person's genitals. They would also swab to try to see any microscopic presence of semen. But not every sexual assault leaves this behind, and we now know that crime can have various sexual motivations and components without penetration. The current investigations sergeant for the Story County Sheriff's Office, Anthony Rode, he told the Iowa State Daily, quote, "You stripped her down, left her naked, posed her on her hands and knees. It was obviously sexually motivated. How do you describe it wasn't sexual just because there's not penetration that would leave some sort of trauma?" And we know now with modern forensics, much less is left to just looking and observing. It's a lot more of physical testing, which just wasn't the case back then. In addition, Story County Attorney Mary Richards added that there was another issue with how things were handled back then. The medical examiner, for some unknown reason, did not take fingernail scrapings, even though she says this was standard practice at the time. Obviously, the future significance of DNA was not known then, and that carried through to how evidence was collected as well. So first, there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen on this case. In fact, Anthony Rhodes described it to the paper as a cluster you-know-what, because he says, quote, you had an Iowa State student, so you had ISU involved, then you had it taking place to pick up in Ames, and then the body was dropped in the county, end quote. So there were detectives from the Iowa Bureau of Investigation, which they have a slightly different name now, but that was the state agency. Then they had Story County sheriffs, and then there was Ames police as well. And then just a few days in, Story County Attorney Charles Vanderburg requested assistance from the FBI. And at that time, it worked a little differently than it does now. They basically said, we don't have any jurisdiction here. You can use our labs, our resources, but we can't help investigate. Today, that line's not as rigid. State and local agencies can now more easily request federal assistance, making it far more common for the FBI to actively support investigations, even when they're not the lead on the case. So one thing that happened was that evidence was collected by 3 different departments that I just mentioned, all getting their own stuff, and it got stored in all these different places. They were not preserved with the same meticulous practices we see today. And present day, Story County sheriffs are the lead on the case, and they have all the evidence in their possession. But unfortunately, I'm just going to tell you up front now, somewhere over the years, the pipe was lost. Nobody has any idea where it is. So that's unfortunate because seeing as though the killer had to hold that to strangle Sheila, that's something that present day detectives may have had a real shot at some sort of forensic evidence. What's more is that Sheila's 3x5 card she had placed in the board envelope was still there a day after the body was found. Media outlets actually got their hands on it, and there was tons of fingerprints all over it. I'll have a picture of it on Instagram. It was not carefully preserved, and because of that, they really just couldn't check for any viable prints. However, the rest of her personal belongings, they sit there stored in evidence, preserved eerily like you're traveling in time. Sheila's body was cremated, so there isn't any way to exhume her body nowadays to see if anything else was missed. Pivoting topics here, Sunday the 28th, the same day Sheila's body was found, another woman's body was found on a rural highway 60 miles away. Her name was also Sheila, 20-year-old Sheila Ray Harrison, and she was found face down in the roadway in Fort Dodge, Iowa, at around 7 a.m. that same Sunday morning, just hours before Sheila Collins would be found. A few miles away, authorities found a man sleeping at the wheel in his car in a ditch, and here's what he relayed happened. He said he was friends with Sheila Harrison. They were heading home from a get-together. He had been drinking heavily, and he went off the road and got his car stuck in the mud. They were in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, and likely because of his significant intoxication, Sheila Harrison said, "I'll go and try to find help." He said she returned 15 minutes later and said that she couldn't find any help or get anybody to answer their door. So she grabbed a flashlight and said she was going to go out further. He then fell asleep at the wheel and didn't see her. Authorities couldn't tell how she died at first glance. Her face was bruised, but she didn't have any other obvious trauma, not one that would match a homicide or being hit by a car. Still, the idea that two young women with brown hair named Sheila were both found dead on a rural Iowa roadway 60 miles apart on the same exact day made people think this is too much to be a coincidence. However, during Sheila Harrison's autopsy, it was found that she had a severe pre-existing cardiac condition that contributed to her death, and she likely just collapsed in the roadway from that. So as strange of a coincidence that was, it was just that, truly a coincidence. The early investigation into the murder of Sheila Collins was intense, with multiple detectives working 16-hour days. They were interviewing everybody, friends, family, tons of students on campus, and they were getting somewhere despite the frustrated Story County Sheriff J.I. Shaley telling the papers he didn't have a blooming thing when it came to suspects or leads to go on, which just made me chuckle a little bit as a very 1960s way of expressing your frustration of something. One lead investigators got on the day her body was found came from a local service station. An employee at the station, which was on U.S. Highway 30, just a mile from where Sheila was found, he said that on the early morning hours of Saturday the 27th, at around 3 a.m., there were a handful of young men at his service station with a girl with long brown hair. He said there were 5 college student-aged boys total, and that he actually took down their license plate because he said they were trying to shoplift candy bars and cigars. And he said they had Lynn County, Iowa plates. He didn't get a good look at the girl, however, but the owner of a restaurant next door said he did. And believe it or not, because this is right on that day she was found, they actually took the restaurant owner down to the morgue to look at her body and to see if it was the same girl. He couldn't conclusively say if it was or not. Another reason why this was considered heavily and thought to be significant is that around Sheila's body was $1 and some change. And her friends, you'll remember, said that she borrowed $2 in cash from them. So it is suspected that they stopped somewhere before she was murdered, her and her killer, which means it's possible someone, even if not at this gas station, someone encountered Sheila and her killer that night. And that's, of course, if he also went into the store with her. But this lead did dry up pretty quickly and nothing really came of it. And I know you're probably thinking, Megan, but what did they do to clear this or to move past it? And there's a lot of that because of how old this case is, where it's just that. It's like, yep, they moved on from that, but there's no real explanation as to why. Authorities also spoke with a girl on campus who said that she had also posted for a ride on the Going My Way board on an earlier date. She said she had received a response from a man who said he could take her where she needed to go, and she had arranged to meet with him at about the same location as Sheila. He also drove a blue Volkswagen. Curiously, when he pulled up and saw she was waiting with her brother, he just drove off without her. So that seems huge and quite possibly, maybe even likely, the same person who picked up Sheila. So they got to thinking, this person must be targeting the job board, and so Ames police set up a bit of a sting operation. And I'll revisit that soon because it would take months, but it would pay off with a suspect. So, just a few days after Sheila's murder, on February 1st, 1968, the student newspaper put up a $200 reward for information, leading to the arrest of the killer of their classmate. That may not seem like a ton of money now, but back then it was the equivalent of almost $2,000 now when you account for inflation. And remember, these are broke college students. They'd eventually get it up a few weeks later to $410, or roughly $3,900 in today's money. For the first few days, the sheriff held a daily news conference on the case, but he stopped after the first week because leads were dying down and he just didn't have any new information. But in that first week alone, the investigators interviewed literally hundreds of people, and they'd go on to interview over 700 over the next few months. Sticking with the timeline, though, on Sunday, February 5th, a nearby crime raised police suspicions. A 16-year-old boy who had been on his way to being paroled from the State Boys Training School, which was a youth correctional institution, he'd been staying at a halfway house. And on that Sunday, he had gone to the home of his advisor in Ames. When the advisor's wife opened the door, she said that her husband wasn't home. And this boy forced his way in and attacked the wife and then sexually assaulted her. Given the proximity, they questioned him, and he denied any involvement in Sheila's case. And when you think about it, most of it wasn't really aligning. I mean, how would he have access to a car and lack of supervision that time of night for that amount of time? And there was nothing ritualistic about the sexual assault he carried out, whereas Sheila's case did have the weird positioning and things like that. By mid-February, a couple of psychics weighed in, which we know isn't uncommon. They didn't know one another, and they did give similar information that matched some other sources, so police took it pretty seriously. Then they received another tip from a woman from a dream she had, and they actually took it so seriously they tracked down a student who had the same name that appeared in this woman's dream. And they did a pretty high degree of investigation on him. They were doing stakeouts, following him, looking into him, and he had no criminal record and likely nothing to do with this. So eventually that did fizzle out, but just so you can see how desperate they were following up on anything. In a February 20th article, the Story County attorney Charles Vanderburg, he said, quote, "We have some things that look promising, but we have nothing major to report. We have questioned several hundred persons, and I would guess we aren't even half done. No one is above suspicion. It could have been a man or a woman or more than one person. It could have been a student, but maybe it wasn't. We're not assuming anything," end quote. He went on to say that they got lots of weird leads that were sending them all over the place, but that they were following up on each and every single one of them. Just 10 days later, on March 1st, Story County Attorney Charles Vanderburg announced his bid at being the Republican nomination for Attorney General. And I did just want to touch on this briefly because this did have some pretty significant collateral damage to the case and really just Sheila's reputation. So, what I'll get into here is how the articles were put out, how the information was released to the media, and what the public and local perception was at the time as a result of this. So I'm just emphasizing this because a lot of what I'm pulling together came from opinion pieces, but I did see for myself the news articles that they're referring to in the opinion pieces that paint the picture. And you'll understand more in a minute. But basically, at first, it was thought that Charles thought this case could really uplift him in his political aspirations. However, in the aftermath, as he's in the midst of hoping to be Attorney General, the case isn't going his way, it's not getting solved. He kind of started using Sheila as a prop. He allegedly began publicly referencing Sheila's lifestyle and alleged associations. He described her as a campus radical and suggested involvement in a drug ring, claims that really shifted attention away from the violence committed against her and created scrutiny toward Sheila herself. And simply put, there is nothing out there to suggest that Sheila was into any sort of drugs or high-risk lifestyle. She was described as quiet and studious with a silly side to her. And Nancy Bowers, who wrote for IowaColdCaseMurders.com about Sheila's murder, she talked about how Sheila was on the synchronized swimming team. She worked in the campus cafeteria as a dishwasher. She just kept a low profile. And Nancy Bowers actually told the student newspaper that as she was talking about this case years later, she'd still hear the damage that was done, where people would say, oh yeah, that girl who sold drugs and was found out in the field in Colo. And she'd have to correct that narrative. It's not to say that if she had sold drugs that her case wouldn't be important, but it's just factually inaccurate and unfair to paint her in that way and ruin her reputation. He eventually bailed out of that primary and resigned from his job a few years later. So that's just what I want to mention about that. I know that jumps around in the timeline a bit. So moving back, let's go to June of 68. Remember I mentioned that sting operation? Well, in June of 68, Ames police had identified someone who had been calling girls on the ISU campus from that ride board and giving fake names. Now, the Iowa State Daily investigative piece has a part 4 where they go through all the suspects in this case, often using pseudonyms. And because I want you to check out their work, I'm going to use the same pseudonyms as them so that when you do go check it out, it's not confusing. So this is the suspect that they refer to as Arthur. Women were receiving phone calls from him where he was using a fake name and asking them to meet him for rides alone, usually at night. The sting operation found he had contacted at least 30 women and used various names. At least one student described his behavior as sexually aggressive, and another said he asked to meet her along Lincoln Way, the very same street where Sheila was seen getting into a car. At the time, Arthur was a graduate student there who lived nearby. He was married with a baby, and he did match the description of some of the witness statements who saw Sheila waiting that night. As detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. When first questioned, Arthur told investigators he had been driving a yellow Mustang in January of 1968. Later, he changed his story, admitting he actually had been borrowing a blue Volkswagen during the time Sheila disappeared. He explained the confusion by saying he had purchased a new car shortly afterwards and simply just forgot which vehicle he had been driving during that time. Then they search his new car and find nylon rope that looks exactly like the rope used in Sheila's strangulation. Furthermore, he could not explain to investigators why he had that. So yes, at this point, not looking very good for Arthur. He had 2 polygraph tests administered, and he failed on the question around lying about his identity to these women. However, he passed on the questions relating to if he knew anything about or was involved in Sheila Collins' murder. And because there was no way to forensically link him back then, all they had was a lot of circumstantial evidence. And so they had to sort of put a pin in it. At this point in late June, they dissolved their full-time investigation into Sheila's murder. And one quick other thing I forgot to mention about Arthur is that he was also considered a suspect in the murder of Dorothy Miller. And if you listen to my Leota Camp episode, I go into Dorothy's murder a bit more. The short version is she was a real estate agent who was lured to a property by a man using a false name. This man met with the realtor twice, once with her and her husband present because she took that precaution, and then he had told the husband-wife duo that he had a young child and a wife and lived in Des Moines, like Arthur did, and they were at ease with him. So when he said he wanted to see the house again just one more time to make a decision, Dorothy went alone. It was then that she was attacked by this man and murdered. The composite sketch the husband did of the suspect very strongly resembles Arthur, but despite being a potential suspect in both Sheila and Dorothy's murders, he's never been charged in either. Do I know if they put his photo in a lineup or put him in a lineup with the husband? No idea. That would make logical sense. Maybe they did and he wasn't able to identify him. I'm really not sure. That definitely lingered for me. From what I can tell, this suspect is still alive today, and he went about his life getting a high-level executive job, and yeah, he's just lived his life. The next break in the case happens in January of 1969, when a former ISU student named Eugene Newberry murdered his teacher fiancée, Anna Mondragon. He strangled her, and her body was found in almost the exact positioning to Sheila Collins, even down to the clothing and the nudity. Reporting on this part is limited, but it sounds like he was questioned due to having campus overlap at the time with Sheila, but nothing definitive came of it. Later in 1969, investigators began to look into the possibility that John Norman Collins, nicknamed the Michigan Co-ed Killer, was possibly involved in Sheila's case. I think this one grasped at straws a bit more. He operated about 500 miles away, and there's nothing else really linking him to Sheila. There are a ton of podcasts out there on him and his crimes, so if you're interested, go check it out, but I don't want to spend too much time on him here. One victim that was originally considered to possibly be a victim of John Norman Collins was Jane Mixer. She was a law student in Michigan who accepted a ride with someone off of a Rideshare board on her campus, and she was later found murdered. Her murder was not solved until DNA advancements tied her case to a man named Gary Lederman in 2005. Now, like Sheila, Jane had been found in a rural area, covered by her coat, and had been strangled. There were other ritualistic things present too, like a book found near her body, and her belongings were scattered nearby as well. Gary was a traveling pharmaceutical salesman, so it wouldn't have been uncommon for him to travel the country. He was also apparently obsessed with John Norman Collins and the murders he was tied to. Gary died in 2019, so if he is connected to Sheila's case at all, he won't face any consequences for it. Police considered the overlap suspicious, but far from enough to pinpoint him as their killer. And now I'm going to continue to jump ahead in the timeline because for decades after the initial reporting on this case, Sheila's case just sat cold. That was until 2009 when the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation created a dedicated cold case unit, funded largely through federal grant money. The goal was to revisit older unsolved homicides using modern forensic advances, particularly new DNA technology that investigators hoped could finally generate leads in cases that had stalled decades earlier. At the time, roughly 150 unsolved murders across Iowa were selected for review, and Sheila Collins' 1968 murder was included among the priority investigations. Her case had long remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved crimes, with preserved evidence still in law enforcement custody and the potential for renewed forensic testing. Investigators believed emerging DNA methods might finally succeed where earlier investigative efforts had failed. For a couple of years, they re-examined evidence, organized files spread across multiple agencies, and evaluated cases like Sheila's for possible forensic breakthroughs. But the progress was cut short. By 2011, before any major breakthroughs were achieved in the Sheila Collins case, the grant funding that supported Iowa's cold case unit expired. Without continued financial support, the formal unit was dissolved, and the concentrated statewide effort to systematically rework cold cases came to an end. After the funding lapse, investigations didn't officially close, but they returned to a more limited model. So for cases like Sheila's, this meant that they would only investigate as new leads emerged or when technological advances justified additional testing. As I wrap up this case, I want to highlight the other suspects that were mentioned in the Iowa State Daily series. One I'll go through quickly is that in 2004, a guy who they're calling Clarence confessed to her murder, but he got almost every detail wrong, including her name at one point. And it turns out he has some pretty significant psychiatric disorder that likely led to his confession, so he was pretty much ruled out. Lastly, there was a suspect they're calling Bernard. He was a lab tech at Iowa State at the same time Sheila was there. He was known for being moody and creepy, and he would go on to have some pretty significant arrests, including one around child molestation, prowling, really all sorts of stuff. He was discharged dishonorably from the military. He was described as, quote, sexually preoccupied, and he was known to fabricate details of his life. On the night Sheila accepted a ride, he called his wife at 10 p.m. at her job to say that he wouldn't be able to pick her up because his blue Volkswagen had gotten a flat tire. His wife would later say he had scratches on his face that night. He told her that he fell changing his tire and that he lost his glasses, and that's how he got the scratch on his face. On the surface, this all sounds very suspicious, but the timeline of how he would have had to do things really didn't add up. The Iowa State Daily article pointed out that in their calculation, he would have had to arrange to get to Sheila at 8:30 on campus, drive the 15 to 20 miles, kill her, dispose of her body and her belongings, then get back to Ames 15 to 20 miles in the other direction yet again, flatten his tire, and call his wife by 10 p.m. Though not to split hairs, but based on the original timeline in the original source material, I clock the pickup time as more like 8 p.m., and a half hour could make a bit of a difference here. Regardless, though, his wife said that if his glasses came off in some sort of struggle 15 miles away, there would be no way he could see to drive 15 miles in the dark. He had really poor vision without his glasses. After more child abuse charges were brought against him in the late 70s, he fled and hasn't been seen by family or friends since 1977. It's unclear what came of him. As a final wrap-up of Sheila's case, I want to acknowledge that Anthony Rode and the current team acknowledges a lot of failures in the original investigation, including straight-up problematic behavior. Rode told the State Daily that original profiles done on the case were, quote, really, really, really bad, not good at all, end quote. And he said that they were racist and sexist. And the comments made about Sheila ranged from crude to victim blaming. Out of respect for her and her memory, I'm not even going to repeat them here, but because current day law enforcement is putting forth the accountability, even though they're investigating it very differently and handling it differently, I did just want to highlight it, because it is significant to the fabric of the case and the lasting impact. As far as today, Rhodes says that the case hinges on forensic advancements. They do have a DNA sample on hand, and it was collected from crime scene evidence. However, he said, quote, they got a mixture of 2 DNA, one female and one male, but the chain is so broken and mixed together that they can't put any kind of profile together that would allow us to identify anybody, end quote. That was from early 2022, 4 years ago. And we know each year advancements make cracking older cases possible. Let's hope that Sheila's could be next. If you have any information on the murder of Sheila Collins, please contact the Story County Sheriff's Office at 515-382-6566. Thank you for joining me for another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you wish to listen to these episodes ad-free, join my Spreaker supporter club. The link is at the bottom of the show notes, and after joining, you can listen while logged into your account or app ad-free. You can help me grow the show for free by just leaving reviews and telling a friend, and also following me on Instagram and TikTok and engaging on there. If you have case suggestions, feel free to reach out to me at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and join me again next Monday.